This felt like it was coming for some time. What's on your mind?
Well, you're absolutely. I thought you gave a very eloquent description of the problem there, really, Sheila. It's been a problem for a very long time because this has been bubbling in the press for days and days and days. And it was always the case, I think, that Laurie Magnus, had he found that the legal advice being given honestly to the Deputy Prime Minister was simply wrong, and she'd done everything she could to get the advice, and it's been wrong, she'd have survived. If she hadn't tried hard enough to get proper advice, she was finished, and that's what's happened. There's no real bright side of this for the Prime Minister and the government, but I have to say, at least there is no rancour here. I thought that Keir Starmer's letter and her letter to him, they were both quite generous-spirited. I don't think there are many people around Westminster who dislike Angela Rayner or think that she herself is corrupt or evil or wicked or anything like that. It's just a very, very sad, very unfortunate thing. But the problem is that she is also deputy leader of the Labour Party. Now, I was listening to Aggie earlier on, suggesting that there might be some way of Keir Starmer stopping there being an election for deputy leader. I'm not sure if that's possible or not, but it's incredibly important because for Keir Starmer, the real danger is that he loses control of something. Imagine if, again, I'm quoting Aggie, Louise Hay stood and became deputy leader of the Labour Party, somebody that Keir Starmer had fired from the cabinet, somebody associated with the soft left. We would all be going to her, we'd be talking to her. The real danger here, therefore, is of a kind of low-level war breaking out between the soft left of the Labour Party, who disagree with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor on tax and many other things, and the Blairites, who may feel that he's not going far enough in other ways. In other words, there's a group of ministers associated with the Blairite wing. I'm thinking of people like Shabana Mahmood and Wes Streeting on the one hand, and there's the soft left on the other. And Keir Starmer really can't afford the Labour Party to go to war at this moment. They're hemmed in, as you suggested, on all sides. It's not just Reform and Jeremy Corbyn. It's the polls, the terrible polls. It's an appalling budget hoving into the horizon in November. It's the status of the government being terribly, terribly poor already. So I think it's a really hard time for Keir. This makes it much, much more difficult.
And what came to mind to me when you were describing that jostling that is almost inevitable around the deputy leadership role was a kind of, Seb Coe, Steve Ovett, 1,500-metre run, and that moment when an opening appears and then the game is on. It feels a bit like that.
The game is on, and I can tell you, I'm sure Aggie knows this as well, all around London, cabinet ministers are talking to each other and talking to journalists about who's going to make what move. The really big other story we don't know much about yet is the suggestion that Keir Starmer is going to use this moment for a much wider cabinet reshuffle, a proper big reshuffle. Now, if that's the case, and that happens this afternoon, then he certainly grabs back the agenda and takes the limelight away from Nigel Farage on his big day. But we have no idea how radical he's prepared to be. Because if he's not going to move any of the big offices of state, Yvette Cooper at Home Office, David Lammy at the Foreign Office, or indeed Rachel Reeves herself, I think the public won't much notice.
You mentioned Nigel Farage, worth saying he is going to give a speech at the party conference, the Reform Party conference. Natasha Clark is there for us, LBC's political editor, and he, I think, has brought that forward. Just see him coming forward onto the podium now, so we'll keep a close eye on that. Aggie, for people who may be just joining us, what did the standards watchdog, Sir Laurie Magnus, what did he find when it came to what she did and didn't do and what she should have done?
So the ethics watchdog, Sir Laurie Magnus, was actually very, very clear cut. All week we were trying to work out what he might say, whether he might say that she didn't breach the ministerial code, but she should have done X, Y, Z, or saying she didn't breach the ministerial code and there was nothing she could have done differently. Actually, in the end, very, very clear cut. He said Angela Rayner's actions failed to meet the highest possible standards of proper conduct over her failure to pay the correct level. Now, he says she did breach the ministerial code. He did also say she'd acted with integrity and with a dedicated and exemplary commitment to public service, but concluded, as I say, that she did breach the ministerial code.
And he said, and Andrew talked there about there being no rancour in the letters between the Prime Minister and Angela Rayner. There's no rancour or harshness in Laurie Magnus's report either. He says that this woman acted in good faith. However, when she took normal legal advice in conveyancing when you're buying a property, what she didn't do, even though that legal advisor said, by the way, this isn't proper tax advice and you should get proper tax advice, is she then didn't get that. And that seems to be the point at which he says, well, it wasn't that you just didn't do it, you even ignored advice to do it.
Yes, I mean, it's a very polite letter. It's very considered, as we would expect. And as I say,
it's a deadly one.
It's completely damning. It is completely and utterly damning because it is so clear-cut by saying that she breached the ministerial code and she didn't take the care that she should have taken with the advice that she received. I don't think there is any way that Keir Starmer could have read this letter and thought that there was any way that Angela Rayner could remain in cabinet, even if he hadn't said yesterday that he would act with whatever report was put in front of him. But no, it's right to say there is no rancour between Keir Starmer or Angela Rayner or indeed anyone really within the cabinet. And actually, I think Andrew and I have both been slightly, well, especially me, have been slightly taken aback by how supportive cabinet colleagues have been this week. Peter Kyle on Andrew's show on Wednesday was so clear that, you know, they were all rallying behind her to the point that it seemed like she really might survive. But this letter, as I say, damning and not really any way she could have done. And she hasn't.
And thoughts from both of you. Andrew, if you start, I just noticed that Nigel Farage's speech has started at the Reform Party conference, and he's saying explicitly, I've moved my speech forward because of what's happened. This is a government deep in crisis, deep in unpopularity within the first year. He is making hay, isn't he?
Well, we hear that he's going to tell his party to be ready for an election early in 2027, that he thinks so great is the economic crisis as much as the political crisis that everything will fall apart and there'll be an early general election. Now, that is, of course, the kind of thing that a kind of insurgent opposition leader would say, but it's nonetheless interesting. I think he would have chosen this to have happened on another weekend if he'd had the chance, but there's no doubt that this is a massive fillip for Labour's opponents, and Reform are ahead of the moment. And never forget, Sheila, that as the polls are at the moment, if there was an election today, Nigel Farage is almost certain to become Prime Minister.
Aggie?
When you speak to people within government, when you speak to MPs, people are thinking about what happens next. They really, really are, which is astonishing in itself with the fact that we're only just over a year in. But MPs are genuinely saying, what happens after May if we have a set of elections next year when there's elections in Scotland, elections in Wales and elections in London too, and we do really, really badly? What happens then? And I think conversations are genuinely live about whether there could be some sort of leadership contest and whether or not Keir Starmer would survive it. So yes, it's Nigel Farage making these statements, but there are live conversations. And I think when you speak to people, they're really split. When you say to some people there might be a leadership contest next May, they say, well, then we've lost the next election for sure. You speak to other people and say, Keir Starmer's going to be Prime Minister at the next, a leader of the Labour Party at the next election. They say, we've lost it for sure. Yeah. So I think there is genuine worry, deep worry.
I mean, you know, we know that Nigel Farage is an opportunist. You know, I mean, that's politics. That's not just him, but he is a very distinct opportunist, isn't he, in the way that he goes about things. He's saying here now, sorry to not look you in the eye, both of you, while I'm talking to you, because I've got one eye on that speech. He's saying here, this government is as bad, if not worse, than the one that went before. A housing secretary who doesn't pay £40,000 of her stamp duty. He's really putting the boot in because he knows that the audience he is speaking to, not just in that room, but the audience he is speaking to is in... well, large part, small part, medium part, who knows? But it's certainly in part the people that we speak to on the programmes here every day who are saying, I'm done with it. I'm done with old politics. And if Nigel Farage is the way to go, I'm prepared to listen. And that's a problem for Keir Starmer, isn't it? It's a problem for the government.
I would just push back a little bit on the notion that they're all the same. Under previous governments in the Conservative years, people broke the ministerial code and stayed on, clung on, including the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. In this case, they tightened up the ministerial code, they toughened it. Angela Rayner reported herself immediately, and as soon as the verdict came back, there was no question that she was going to go. This is how the system is supposed to work. I don't think they are all the same. I think if anybody reasonable looks at the detailed complexities around stamp duty and Angela Rayner's trust for the child and the rest of it, I defy anyone to say that this was an easy decision to take for her and that she could have done this without taking very, very detailed legal advice. She's paid the price for not doing it, but I don't think, frankly, they're all the same.
I would just, to Andrew's point, I've had a message while I've been in here, Sheila, from a Labour grandee who has messaged me saying, if you're interested, it's worth looking at the HMRC website on stamp duty. It seems to be rather ambiguous in offering guidance on what is a main residence and what is a second dwelling. It's weird, and while I don't know whether it had anything to do with the Rayner case, it needs to be clarified. So I think there is going to be lots of calls for this to be tightened up as well, which I'm sure our colleague Tom Swarbrick will be delighted about, because he's always complaining about how complicated the tax system are. But I think that might be another potential consequence of this as well.
Although it won't change anything that's happened today.
Absolutely not.
And Andrew, you touched there on what this will mean for the Labour Party's own machinations, and I'd go wider than the party, Labour movement's own machinations. Just elaborate a little bit on that for me.
Well, it's pretty clear that when it comes to, for instance, economic growth, tax, workers' rights, there's a part of the Labour Party which comes really from the Blair years in particular, very, very influential in number 10 at the moment. Tim Allen, a former Blair aide, has just gone in there, very, very powerful, and Tony Blair very much involved every week himself, briefing people, which basically says, don't raise any more tax, it's far too dangerous, we don't like this workers' rights agenda, it's too difficult to employ people as a result of it, and don't be too hard on Israel over, there's a whole bunch of people who think those kinds of things and therefore believe that Keir Starmer has to be nudged or pushed a bit more towards the centre-right. And then there's a big chunk of the Labour Party, the so-called soft left. And post Angela Rayner, I would say Ed Miliband would be a very obvious figure in there, as well as Louise Hay and plenty of others, who basically feel that Labour has lost a bit of its soul, that actually a Labour government should be taxing the rich more, should be looking at wealth taxes, should be supporting unions in their strikes and their actions, and should be much, much more aggressive about Israel and Gaza. Now, some of those people, as we know, have gone off or are prepared to go off and join Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana's new party. But there are many of them still inside the Labour Party. And I think what would be almost lethal for Keir Starmer right now, when he's under such a lot of pressure, is for that argument to break out on the floor of the Labour Party conference next month, where you'd have sort of left-wing activists campaigning for one candidate, more right-wing activists campaigning for another. And just imagine if, as it were, a non-Keir Starmer candidate won that job. It would be really, really difficult. I think if he's thinking about this now and he's got any time for sort of clear thought, that's what he'll be worrying about.
Thank you very much.